Hi, everybody. This is our third poem that we're getting into. Um, we are slowly chugging along through our poetry unit. We only have two more poems after this one, so that's pretty exciting. But our third poem is called If I Can Stop One Heart from Breaking by Emily Dickinson. I had a couple of students in class say that she looks kind of boring. I can tell you that she is not boring. And that her poetry is very, very beautiful. So let's go ahead and get into Miss Emily Dickinson. So she was born in Massachusetts in 1830. So yes, this is 19th century poetry. I promise it is not anything crazy difficult to understand or read. So take a deep breath. It'll be fine. She lived most of her life in solitude, taking care of her parents and writing her poetry. And the reason that she spent so much of her time in seclusion, a lot of people think it was because of depression or severe anxiety or even a condition called agoraphobia. And for those of you that don't know what agoraphobia is, it's basically this intense, extreme fear or inability to go outside for whatever reason. So a lot of agoraphobics just stay in their homes and they do not leave their properties. And so Emily Dickinson was believed to be one of those. Where I don't know for sure if she was ever properly diagnosed that way. I don't even know if agoraphobia was even a disease somebody could have back then. But regardless, that is something that historians think that maybe she had. And one of the reasons why she, didn't talk to anybody or do anything outside of the home. A lot of people also believed that she may have been a lesbian, which is interesting, especially because obviously we don't hear a lot about people who were gay back then because it wasn't. First of all, it was, taboo. It was frowned upon. So people really didn't talk about it. So, but anyway, kind of scandalous. So they believe that Emily Dickinson was in love with her advisor, Susan, who was married to Emily Dickinson's older brother. So basically, she was in love with her sister-in-law, which is pretty crazy, right? There isn't a lot of information on Emily's love life, obviously, because she, secluded herself. They say that the man that she was in love with is a mystery, if it even is a man, right? Especially with this idea that maybe she was a lesbian, but I thought that was pretty interesting to share with you. You do not have to write that piece of information out if you don't want to. Really, guys, all I want you to get out of this slide is the first two bullet points and the last one. The middle two are just kind of extra. And finally, Emily Dickinson died at the age of 55 from kidney disease, which is pretty young, right? So let's go ahead and get into some of her work. So Dickinson is thought to be one of the two leading poets of the 19th century, and I would even argue one of the better poets, like even today. And you'll understand why I say that, hopefully, when we start reading some of her work. But she writes beautifully, and it's different than a lot of the other poetry that we've read so far. So I'm hoping that you guys like it. She wrote close to 1,800 poems in her lifetime, and she hand-bound them by herself into poetry books. I think there were something like 40 volumes of her poetry that she made by hand. And while she was alive, only 10 of her poems were published. And even those 10, they didn't have her name on it. She wasn't given credit. And this is because back then, yes, women received education, and this was mostly with wealthy women who could afford it, or their families could afford it. Emily Dickinson's father was a lawyer, so they were pretty well off. So Emily was educated, and this is where her love of poetry kind of came from. But she was only educated up to the age of 16, I believe, and that's when she kind of became a recluse and kept herself to her parents' home, where she took care of them for the rest of their lives, and the rest of hers too. But anyway, so those 10 poems that were published, women, again, we go back to when we talked about the lottery. Women worked in the home. They did not work outside of the home. That was the men's job. And it's the same idea here, except magnified by 10. Men worked outside of the home. That was their job. Women's jobs were to keep the home, entertain guests, take care of children, stuff like that. And if they tried to, be successful, do work outside of the home, it was very much frowned upon. And so her poems were published without her name to really protect her identity. And obviously, if they were published with a woman's name, they may not be as well received. So that is why her name was not put to those 10 original poems to begin with. And it was actually pretty common practice for women writers to use a fake name, and with that a fake male name, so that their work could be published in the public, which is pretty crazy, right? We've come a long way. Then the rest of her poems were published after her death. Her younger sister found the 40 different books of her poetry, and she published them for her after she passed away. Emily is known for her experimental type of writing. So she liked to mess with the form of poetry, how words are arranged. She hated punctuation, and you'll see that kind of added in there willy-nilly with the poem that we're about to read. She also kind of messed with punctuation a lot, so she liked to break rules when it came to writing. And finally, her work was influenced by her religion, which was Calvinism. And it often, like, her poetry is very lyrical. So it reads like a hymn or a ballad. So it sounds very musical in nature. There are only 2 themes with this poem. It's not a very long poem. But the 2 themes include finding the meaning of life and love, and specifically the selfless kind of love. And again, obviously these will make sense hopefully when we start reading, and we'll talk about these more as we read. Literary devices that we see in this poem include alliteration, which is when a letter or a sound is repeated. We have a metaphor again, so comparing 2 things without, like, or as. We have more symbolism. Again, average everyday things represent something else. We have personification this time, which is when animals, objects, or anything not human is given human characteristics or qualities. So whether that's them being able to talk or sing or whatever it is, right? And then finally, we have more imagery, which appeals to the 5 senses to create a vivid picture. Guys, the ones that are repeating, metaphor, symbolism, imagery, you don't have to write the definitions for those unless you want to. Just make sure you include them so that you remember what literary devices are going to be popping up in this poem. But with personification and alliteration, make sure you write the definitions down just as a reminder. All right, then we have poetic devices, and I think this is the last slide. The type of poem is not actually recognized, so it's not like it's blank verse or a sonnet. So there isn't a specific label given to the type of poem that we're reading, but it does have end rhyme. So we did a rhyme scheme practice worksheet for extra credit where we did the AB, CB scheme or whatever. This is a poem that we can do that with. The last 2 we haven't been able to. So there is a rhyme scheme here, and it's end rhyme. And then finally, we have repetition again, and it is with the line, "I shall not live in vain." And this will make more sense when we start reading. But that is all of the notes that we have. So obviously you can always stop and pause and write down what you need to as you go. That's fine. Just make sure that you post your notes to the submission space, and I will see you all during Zoom. Thank you.